G'day everyone, David Wilson here, coming to you on behalf of Zach's Place. Zach's Place is a community church that usually meets in Yarra Junction as often as it possibly can. Yarra Junction's a beautiful place in just outside of Melbourne, the Yarra Valley and the Yarra Ranges. And Zach's Place is a community church that was started up by the Yarra Valley chapter of God Squad. And we meet together there as a community of faith, seeking to know more about what it is to follow Jesus and what that means for our community and in our community. So we're really glad that you're a part of this presentation. Welcome. It's good to have you with us. And we've been putting this sort of material onto video for the last couple of months while we're in this enforced isolation during COVID-19. And we'll continue to do that for as long as necessary. It'd be nice when we can start meeting back together again there in Yarra Junction, but for the time being, it's not possible. So here we are. Now, we've been looking at James, and James is the brother of Jesus, and he was the leader of the church in Jerusalem. And the church in Jerusalem underwent a whole lot of really bad persecution and got scattered right around the world. And the persecution didn't stop. They were still being persecuted, still suffering a lot. And they had one big question, and that is, how do we follow Jesus? How are we faithful to following Jesus in the midst of the persecution and the suffering while we're scattered around the world? We're dispersed. And how do we continue to be faithful? Very important question. And James is seeking to answer that question in some very practical ways. And when we come here to chapter 3, verses 1 to 12, if you've got a Bible with you, it'd be good to pause on the video and just have a read of those verses, especially from a modern translation. James chapter 3, verses 1 to 12. In these verses, he's talking about the power of the tongue, the awesome power of words and the words that we use. So, right away you get the idea that James has been very practical. People are saying, how should we live? How should we be faithful to following Jesus? And he says, well, you've got to watch your words. You've got to be really careful of how you speak to one another. He's writing to the church, and he's saying to them in these verses that the control of our tongues is really important. We really need to watch what we say, because words are really powerful. He says the tongue is small, but incredibly powerful. He likens it to the bit in the mouth of a horse, that it guides it. Small bit, but it guides the whole horse. Or he says it's also like a small rudder that's used to guide large ships. Or if you like, an ember that starts a bushfire. You remember Paul Kelly saying, from little things, big things grow. And I think he was being much more positive, that you just plant a seed and some really good things grow out of it. But the true is, it's true in a negative sense as well, and that is that it just takes a spark to get a fire going, an ember to get a bushfire going, or a little rudder to steer a huge ship. And we really need to watch what we say, because our words might be really small, but they're very, very powerful. And so be careful. James goes on to say that it's really hard to tame the tongue. It's small, it's powerful, and it's so easily out of control, James says in these verses. And he says it's a strange complexity of good and of evil. It praises God on the one hand, and it curses mankind on the other hand. And the idea of cursing mankind is wishing evil upon it. So he says, this is strange. In fact, he says he's quite perplexed about it. He reflects on this and he's bewildered. How can this be so, he laments. On the one hand, this tongue within us can praise God, all this beautiful praise of God. At the same time, it can curse, it can wish evil upon other people. How can this be so? But this is what our tongues are like. That's what he's chatting about in these verses. Now, if we've been following along with James across the couple of chapters that we've already studied, we've heard him talking about a lot of practical things. In chapter 1, he said, you need to seek wisdom to be the people of God, to be faithful to Jesus. to be following him in the midst of persecution, in the midst of hard times, you really need to gain wisdom. And he talks about that in chapter 1. And that seeking of wisdom and that finding of wisdom would see itself worked out in good works. This is what he talks about in the first couple of chapters. And those good works would be especially for the marginalised. So if you're seeking wisdom on how to faithfully follow Jesus in these days, you'll find that you've got to be into good works, and especially for the marginalised. And he also said that we would find that there's no favouritism. You don't favour one person over another. And that there wouldn't be materialism, that you're not going to be materialistic and trust in wealth and everything, because that's just foolishness. And that you really need to be strong in the face of hard times, and you need to be doers of the word, not just hearers only. So this is all the stuff from chapters 1 and 2, and he's been very practical in answering that question of how should we then live. And now he comes to the point in chapter 3, and you also have to be careful of how you speak. You have to be careful of the way that you use your tongue. It needs to be controlled. Very practical stuff, cutting right across the bows, really, of everyday life. And this is the stuff that we live all the time. We speak and we live, and we do good works and so forth. He says that words are powerful, doesn't he? And he falls into line with so much of Scripture in this one. For instance, just as an example, in Solomon, one of the kings back in the Old Testament. And Solomon says in Proverbs, a book that he wrote, Proverbs 18:21, he says that the tongue has the power of life and of death. In other words, the words that we use can cause people to be glad that they're alive, or, on the other hand, wish that they were dead. Such is the power, isn't it, of bullying, of slander, of ridicule. All those things can cause great hurt and can cause people sometimes to wish they were dead, and even go further than that. We hear about suicides, for instance, because of bullying online and offline. And people use their words to attack other people and can destroy them in the process. But the good news is, if the tongue is powerful, it's also powerful to do great good. And so such is the power of encouragement and kindness and forgiveness. And these are life words. These are words that cause other people to be glad that they're alive. So Solomon is saying the tongue is powerful. Yes, words are powerful. It has the power of death. It has the power of life. And James is saying exactly the same thing. It's a small little thing within us, but it can create havoc, but it can also do an enormous amount of good. Now, what I like to do whenever we open Scripture like this, as you know, is to say, well, what about Jesus? Did Jesus live this? Is James in line with Jesus in this particular case? There are examples of how Jesus refused to speak in the midst of trial. So he refused to say any words. He held his tongue. And it was probably the best thing he could possibly do. And there's also examples of Jesus and how he spoke assertively in ways that were often received badly, especially by the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the religious leaders of the day. His attacks on the Pharisees, as recorded in Matthew 23, for instance, his answers to some of the questions along the way come to mind as ways that he used his words in a confrontational sort of way. So if Jesus did that tells me that the control of the tongue that James is teaching here doesn't preclude truth-telling and confrontation. It's not always being nice and avoiding confrontation and so forth. Control of the tongue may involve some hard truth from time to time, but it must be controlled. That's what James is saying, and that was certainly the case with the example of Jesus. Control of the tongue. Sometimes it might involve telling people things that they don't really want to hear, but it's the way that we do it. It must never be an attack on the person, and it must never be a put down or slander or gossip or anything like that, because that's really destructive. But constructive criticism, offered in the right way at the right time, Solomon said in Proverbs that it's like pieces of gold in settings of silver. It's just very, very precious, very, very good thing to be involved in. The right words at the right time, given in the right way. And that's what James is saying here as well. So what? What does that mean to us today? I reckon the challenge is there for all of us. As I said, this is really practical stuff. It involves what we do every day. And James is saying this is how you live for Jesus, even in the hardest of times. You know, the culture around us seems to be into a lot of slander and a lot of gossip and a lot of criticism, destructive criticism, a lot of putting people down, a lot of ridicule. Ridicule is used a lot of sarcasm used a lot, and these are words that can be so destructive and that can hurt so much. And I reckon with social media, like Twitter and Facebook and so forth, you know, this is even more dangerous than ever before, because people, there's a sort of like a depersonalisation of things you put onto Facebook and onto Twitter and so forth, because you're not actually facing the person, and people tend to be even meaner and even more slanderous and gossiping in social media than they are face to face. That's not always so, but it can happen. And so we're living in a world that is getting sucked into a destructive use of words. And what James is saying is not so with you. Jesus said that, not so with you. And James is saying, you know, be really careful how you use your words. Don't get sucked in to the culture around you that puts other people down, that attacks other people. You know, in social media, somebody disagrees with you, and you get all this attack on you as a person, not just on your ideas and not just on your opinions, but on you as a person. And that happens in the church as well. It happens in the church, you know, when we might say something or question something or doubt something, and we get an attack on us, as though, you know, we are personally to be attacked, and it's not good. It can be really destructive. It's too easy for us to slip into that realm, and we should want nothing of it. I reckon what James is saying to us today is that, you know, you want to learn and to have wisdom, to know how to discern, to be truth tellers, and to confront well, but without wishing evil upon others. Because truth is really important, no doubt about that. But you don't have to wish evil. You don't have to slander and gossip and so forth. I think James is saying to us today that, you know, you want to learn how to use your tongues for good, and for your words to be pure and genuine, that they can cause people to be glad that they're alive rather than wish they were dead. I reckon that's a great challenge for us. And I think this applies within the family, within the church, within the workplace, down at the shops, in the neighbourhood. It applies all over the place, doesn't it? Because as I've been saying, it's a part of daily life. Imagine a community of people following Jesus in a neighbourhood who were committed to use words to bring life rather than death. Imagine that. Not just one person, not just two or three, a community of people, a community of faith, committed to using words that are life words, that bring life into a person's thinking, that bring life into a neighbourhood. I think that's what James is challenging us to. God help us as we seek to be that community of people in the Yarra Valley and beyond. Thanks for listening. And as always, if you want to get in touch with me and say anything about this, David Roach Wilson, R-O-A-C-H, David Roach Wilson at gmail.com. See you next week.